Hi guys, it's Miss Kim and I am here with your Victorian history lesson. So this is going to be a little bit different because I feel like a lot of times our Victorian history lessons we do a lot of just discussion and talking about things and the way things are different now and then, and it's a lot of participatory on your part. But I've tried to think of the best way that I can continue for us to do our Victorian history. And so I've decided that we will have a lesson we'll be doing a little bit of learning about Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who is a very well known Victorian author, author of the Sherlock Holmes series of books and short stories. And so how we're going to do that is I'm going to tell you a little bit about Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and then I am going to link you guys to a PDF version of a Sherlock Holmes story, as well as some assignments following that story. I'm also going to give you some links for a couple different resources that you can use to go along with this. One being an audiobook version of the story. Also one being a television adaptation of the story from the early 80s. There are some differences in the televised version from the written version. The other thing is there's actually a really cool video of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. It's the only one in existence of him actually speaking on camera. So we do have that to look at, which is pretty cool as well. So like I said, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who is the author of the Sherlock Holmes stories and a lot of other stories as well. So he is born in 1859, sort of middle of this Victorian era, and he's born in Scotland. He is he's born into a family that is a very like artistic family. Like both of his parents are very artistic. His mom is really well educated for this time period, and she loves to read, and she's always sharing all the stories that she reads with Arthur when he's little. So he grows up with all of these like really delightful sort of like outlandish stories that his mom likes to share with them. When he gets to be a little bit older, he has his immediate family, his parents are very like artistic and believe in kind of like this like telling stories and doing like fun kind of things, but he has some wealthy family members who really insist upon him going to a boarding school. And so he is shipped off to a boarding school, and he spends like 7 years at this boarding school. It's not particularly like a great time in his life. He doesn't really fit in with a lot of the other kids, and he's not really like used to this very strict authoritarian type of education style. And it's a very strict boarding school. There's a lot of rules. But he does find that it's a place where he starts to explore his love of writing. When he leaves boarding school, he decides he's going to become a doctor. So he goes to medical school. He spends 4 years there doing his medical school. Also during this time, over some breaks, he becomes a ship's doctor. So he goes on board of a couple different expeditions as the doctor on the ship. So he the first one is to Antarctica, which really inspires him and gives him the inspiration to write a couple of stories he will write later that are take place out on the sea. He also goes on an expedition to Africa and gets a lot of inspiration for some of his future stories from that as well. When he comes back, he starts a small practice. It takes him a little while to kind of be successful in that practice. During this time, he's writing stories, and he's really struggling to make it as an author. He gets married in 1886, and he starts to write during this year his first mystery novel, and so it's called A Tangled Skein. 2 years later, that novel gets actually renamed, and it's named A Study in Scarlet, and it finally gets published, and it's published in kind of a collection of stories, like a magazine. It's an annual that gets published, and this is the first place where we are introduced to the characters of Detective Sherlock Holmes and his assistant Watson. So after he publishes this, he finally starts to get the recognition that he's desired for a long time. That becomes the first in a series of about 60 stories that he pens over his lifetime, featuring those characters of Sherlock Holmes and Watson. He also kind of gets into the Victorian, all the rage, what we've talked about many, many times, of the Victorians being inspired by and like almost obsessive about this idea, this movement of spiritualism. A lot of interest in the ideas of ghost and how we can communicate with ghosts and these sorts of things. So he's kind of from about 1817 to 1916, or 1887 to 1916 is when he's really involved in the spiritualism movement. And he writes during that period of time 3 books that are really sort of autobiographical. They're really based on his experiences, where he doesn't outright come out and say, like, this book is an autobiography of myself. Their experts really believe that these stories are based on his life. So he becomes really a successful author during his lifetime. He retires from medicine, and he writes the 60 stories on Sherlock Holmes during this time. He writes the 3 autobiographical novels. He also produces several historical novels, The Great Shadow, Rodney Stone, and he's putting out books like every year. I mean, he's like really a prolific writer. His best known Sherlock Holmes books come out during this period where he's involved in spiritualism, so from about 1890 to the early 1900s, and those are The Sign of Four, The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes, and The Hound of Baskervilles, which are the 4 best known Sherlock Holmes novels, probably. In 1893, he sort of, I guess, is thinking maybe he's a little bit tired of the Sherlock Holmes character, and so he attempts to write Sherlock Holmes out of the book. So he attempts to write a book that kills Sherlock Holmes off, because he wants to start really focusing more on spiritualism, and he's just kind of like done with Sherlock Holmes. However, fans don't really appreciate this and are pretty riled up. He gets a lot of letters and a lot of almost hate mail, I guess, if you want to say, for those times, demanding the return of Sherlock Holmes. And so he does give in, and he does reintroduce Sherlock Holmes in The Hound of Baskervilles, and then later he brings him back again in The Adventures of the Empty House. And he continues to write books on a variety of topics, spiritualism being one of his things that he sort of starts to focus on in that early 1900s, particularly like the 1910s through the 1920s. And during that time, he writes a book called New Revolution, The Vital Message, The Wanderings of a Spiritualist, and History of Spiritualism. In 1928, his final 12 stories about Sherlock Holmes are released. And the thing to keep in mind is that a lot of the Sherlock Holmes stories are short stories, so they were often released in volumes. He dies in 1930, And the story goes that he dies in his garden while clutching his heart with one hand and holding a flower in the other. So the reason that I wanted us to kind of look into Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and the Sherlock Holmes stories is because they very much are set during the Victorian period. And not just are they set during the Victorian period, but they were actually written during the Victorian period. So we get a really good idea, a view of what life was like. There are lots of stories that come out, now even that are written during this time period, but to have a view of something that's set in that same time period, written actually in that time period, really gives us a much better view of what life was like. So sort of like when we read A Christmas Carol by Dickens. He's another author that really writes during this time period and about this time period. One thing to keep in mind with that is that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle is a British writer. So some of the language that you will encounter when you're reading this story may seem a little off or different to you. Some spellings may be a little bit different as well. And so this is written in, traditional British style. So there are going to be some spelling differences. If you find something that's really puzzling to you, I think for the most part, you can kind of use context to figure out something that maybe seems a little off. But if you really are struggling, ask your parents for help with this one. You can also Google if you're really struggling with a word. You can also send me an email and I will do my best to explain the words. But again, I feel like if you are paying attention to the context of the story where these words are, that you will get the hint of what they mean. They're not so far off and so foreign that you won't recognize them. It's just sometimes when you're starting to read British literature for the first time, it can be a little bit hard to get used to. So when you're going to get a link to the PDF of this story that we are reading, which we are going to be. It's a short story, but it's long for a short story. It's nothing that I don't think you guys can totally handle and do. But you're going to have several assignments at the end that are comprehension questions and some vocabulary and a little quiz. This lesson is meant to be spread out over a couple of weeks. So this lesson will take the part that will supplement our lessons for 317 and 324. But if you don't get all of the work done in those 2 class periods, we would probably take maybe like 3 class periods on this if we were meeting in class. So don't feel stressed out if you aren't able to get it all done. And if you have any questions, or if you're struggling with the reading of it, and if you're having trouble with like some of those like words in the context, remember I am linking to an audio version of it, so you could totally do that as well. The video that linking to the televised version, don't like supplement that for reading or listening to the story, because it does have some differences in the story. It'll make it really hard for you to answer your comprehension questions if you only watch that video. So if you have any questions, remember you can send me an email. Look in the descriptions and you will find the links to the PDF of the story and the questions. The questions and everything are just following their like the last pages of that PDF, so it's all one file. You'll also find the links to those other videos that I have mentioned. So I hope you guys enjoy and take your time on this one, and if you have any questions, please just let me know. Thanks.